Hello, this is Marcos Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and this is my fourth video in my current series on social isolation and loneliness. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the implications of the research that I've discussed in my previous videos on this topic on current social distancing policies. There are a few things that emerge from the current research. We know that social isolation is a kind of self-reinforcing thing. It is there's a negative habit formation here. The more socially isolated people are, the more that increases social anxiety and negative interpretations of social cues, and that tends to reinforce socially isolating tendencies. We know that there is a decrease in social reward associated with chronic social anxiety or even chronic loneliness, and therefore there's a reduction in pro-social behaviour. Socially isolated people or lonely people are less motivated to socialise. There's also an increased potential for violent or antisocial tendencies, as we saw from, I think, the study I mentioned in rats in the very first video I did, that the male rats who were taken out of rat society were more placid, but then when they were reintroduced into society after a period of isolation were much more aggressive. And that correlates with the human information, the human data about increased social anxiety in socially isolated people and a more negative interpretation of facial expressions and social cues. So this is really interesting given the current situation, because what we're seeing globally is increased potential, certainly, if not actual civil unrest, such as riots or civil disturbances. But really what's more obvious, I think, generally, is increased negative thinking, like this proliferation of conspiracy theories. Now, I'm not going to comment in this video on whether any of those theories might be correct. I think it's good to have an open mind on these things, perhaps not so open that your brain falls out, but open enough that you are not being completely naive. But it is nevertheless interesting that there's such a proliferation of theories which are anti-authoritarian in tone and impute the most negative possible interpretations to the motives of people in authority. Theories which, a year ago would have been laughed out of town. Now, of course, that is because the global situation at the moment with the current pandemic is a bit mad, but it also seems to me to fit very neatly with the research I've discussed in the previous videos in this series about the actual behavioural, psychological and physiological, the stress-inducing effects of social isolation. Everybody's background level of social anxiety is keyed up, and people's negative interpretations of social cues and motivations are also enhanced. This is a really potently reactive and inflammatory brew. And I think it's useful, whatever you believe is truly going on in the world, I think it behooves us all to be aware of the potential for really negative consequences to our own personal, emotional and physical health, getting caught up in that loop of negativity, which is induced by social isolation, potentially. So we need to be a bit careful or mindful of the possibility that the remedy, that social distancing, could be, in some cases, worse than the disease, literally, in terms of the morbidity, the mortality induced by the virus. The actual mortality induced by social distancing, if indeed social distancing leads to increased social isolation and loneliness, as there are good logical reasons to suppose that it might, well, we know from the research that social isolation alone increases the risk of death by 29%. So over time, the effects of social distancing, depending on the amount of death caused by the actual current viral pandemic, could potentially be as bad as the virus itself. We don't know at this stage, so this isn't a criticism of any government's response. I mean, there's a lot to criticize, but I don't know, I wouldn't want to be in charge of things at the moment. There are very tough decisions to make. But the issue here is that we've got to be careful that the remedy doesn't turn out to be worse than the disease. Also, I just wanted to mention a bit of, I saw a clip by Dr. Jordan Peterson. Now, whatever you think of him, I think as a psychiatrist, as a psychotherapist, as a lecturer, he's very interesting. And I'll link that video in the description box below on YouTube, when he was talking about the rise of authoritarianism, the increased tendency to very authoritarian politics, which is strongly correlated with contagion. So in other words, in populations which experience infections, a higher rate of infectious disease, politics tends to become more authoritarian. And he explains this psychologically by the fact that when you're exposed to infections, you tend to want to put more boundaries around things and control things more and limit things. So the popular tolerance for very authoritarian politics, which can potentially lead to some pretty dark places, increases. I think it's in a little video clip called Why Hitler Bathed 5 Times a Day or something, which I'll link below. But I thought that was another interesting think piece. These are just things, I'm not suggesting you act on these things, these are things that we need to all be mindful of. The last thing I wanted to mention, given the current situation and the quote-unquote new normal, is that in this paper by Bujdok and Dunbar on social isolation, very recent paper in 2020, they mention that childhood experiences have lifetime effects, because what you experience in childhood actually causes epigenetic changes, so that, for example, if a child experiences stress, such as may be induced by separation from one's peer group, increased social isolation, particularly if there are more difficulties at home due to increased stress in the household, for example, may be experienced if one or both parents lose their jobs and they're not mixing with their peers, etc., etc. If those children experience more stress and don't have good social outlets, then that's likely to cause literal changes to their genes, which will be passed on to the next generation and may cause behavioural changes in their children. So in other words, the things that are going on now, if they last for a couple of years or more, have ramifications potentially for generations. So how we handle this is going to have reverberations for a very long time to come, potentially. I think I'm going to stop there. This is all potentially quite worrying, but in the next video, I'm going to be talking about remedies, what we can do. And I'm going to be focusing on remedies for the negative effects, both mental and physical, caused by social isolation and loneliness. And these are strategies that all of us, any of you watching, can implement that will help to buffer you and your family from some of the more unpleasant potential outcomes from this reduced period of social contact. So anyway, I hope this video was entertaining. If you liked it, please like it. Please do share the video if you think it'd be useful or interesting to anyone you know, and please do subscribe, and I will hopefully see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.